Now let's proceed with the conflict analysis of culture. So what does conflict theory say in general? Just a bit of a reminder that there's always going to be a struggle in society between the haves and the have-nots, between those who are in the upper class and those who are in the lower classes. And this struggle, according to conflict theory, is based on economics and wealth. Now, that wealth is the basis of the privileged position that the upper class have. And because they have a privileged economic position, that leads to social privileges in terms of education and just basic access to opportunity, that sort of thing. Now, the upper class, the privileged class in society, they do what they can to maintain their advantaged position, and other classes who are below them do what they can to try to increase their advantage. Class struggle. How does it view culture? Conflict theory would take the same general approach looking at conflict and struggle. So conflict theory would look at those groups of people who have been marginalized, who have been kind of pushed to the side by the dominant upper class culture, or maybe even completely excluded, and how they've tried in the past and continue to try to increase their own cultural rights. So the rights revolution refers to this process by which socially excluded groups have struggled to win equal rights under the law. And the term rights revolution is usually used to refer to the time in the 60s and into the 70s when cases were before the courts greatly expanded civil rights and civil liberties. Because so much was going on during these 2 decades, it's known as the rights revolution. How did this really come about? Well, this whole concept of basic human rights for all has always existed. It didn't suddenly emerge in the 60s. But it wasn't really until after World War II that this belief spread to eventually evolve into what we are all used to now. Why after World War II? Because it was during that war that blatantly racist and discriminatory behavior occurred based on really despicable beliefs. So the Nazi agenda included the elimination of specific groups of people who were viewed by the Nazis as much lower than the German race. And their solution was to simply get rid of particular groups that didn't fit with the Nazi agenda. So have these feelings always existed? Absolutely. But during World War II, Hitler's plan to exterminate anybody who didn't fit with his an ideal German citizen took that to an entirely different level. Anybody that was a Jehovah's Witness, homosexual, of Polish ethnicity, of Roma ethnicity, of Slavic ethnicity, anybody who was incurably sick, which essentially meant anybody who was disabled or had any kind of mental health issue, were all targeted for extermination. In addition, anybody who opposed Germany politically. So any Soviet prisoners of war were exterminated, as well as other POWs. And the group, of course, that everybody is most familiar with in reference to the attempted genocide of Hitler during World War II were the European Jews, and it's estimated that about 2/3 of their population was wiped out, between 5 to 6 million people. So again, it isn't that these ideas of human rights first emerged during or right after the war. It's that ideas against them were violently and consistently applied without guilt or remorse or second thought during World War II. The rest of the world was so stunned that when news of concentration camps and gas chambers first began to make it back to North America, some people simply didn't believe it. They couldn't believe that something so horrible could be going on. They couldn't even begin to grasp the idea that some human beings could be so inhuman. So it was after World War II, in October of 1945, when the United Nations was first established. And the main goal of the United Nations was preventing another world war and of doing what it could to maintain international peace and security, all of which necessarily made promoting human rights part of their agenda. Now, the UN also had, as part of its mandate, to foster social and economic development in developing countries, to protect the environment and provide humanitarian aid in a famine or a natural disaster or armed conflict. And this was in part the impetus for the rights revolution referred to in the textbook. That included the rights of women during the 1960s, the rights of people with special needs, such as the right to an education for them, the same as children without special needs, the rights of minority groups, such as the civil rights movement, the rights of gays and lesbians, even language rights in Canada. It really was a culture of rights revolution. All these different groups of people were mobilizing themselves around the same time to force societal change. And according to conflict theory, it really is a struggle, in every sense of the word struggle, in terms of gaining equal rights regarding to culture. And because of this, conflict theory views the rights revolution accomplishing two specific goals. So one of the first things it did was that for those people who have been pushed to the side in the past, those people who have been marginalized in the past regarding culture, it recognizes their grievances. It kind of validates their feeling of being excluded, or at least not being full participants in the dominant culture, and provided them an assurance that their exclusion was important, that it was recognized on a wide scale. And that is important, to be told or shown for decades, if not longer, that your culture is not relevant or recognized, is in many ways saying that that person is not relevant or not recognized, that they don't have any place in society. So gaining that acknowledgement was extremely significant. And the second thing the rights revolution did, according to conflict theory, was that actually encouraged them to feel pride or feel good about their identity and their culture, to feel good about their heritage. Again, until that began, they had generally been told and encouraged to not practice their own culture, to not view their own culture as something positive. They were shown and they were told that it didn't matter. So in other words, what they valued was not valuable to the rest of society, and that changed. Not overnight, but it did begin to change. Continuing on, it's important to remember this, that although we are constantly told, in Canada at least, that multiculturalism is a wonderful philosophy and how valuable it is and how everybody in society benefits from it. Historically speaking, this is not the way the world was, and certainly not the way Canada was. So today we're really used to words like multiculturalism and cultural diversity. But historically, these terms, even for the most part, the idea of them didn't exist. Instead, all members of society would be raised and focused on one culture, involving one set of cultural practices. One set of beliefs, one set of values, one religion, one perspective. But when Europe and North America began to undergo revolutions of various kinds, these led to transformations of societies as a whole. So for example, the Renaissance was a period of European history following the Middle Ages. And it's actually the French word for rebirth because it was a period of great social and cultural change. The Renaissance was a period of history characterized by imagination and creativity and innovation. And because of this, because it was such a break from the conformity of the Middle Ages regarding art and architecture and intellectual thought and literature and science and philosophy, it's extremely important. The Protestant Reformation was also a movement in Europe during the 16th century. And during the Protestant Reformation, the beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church were challenged instead of being blindly accepted. Of course, this caused a lot of religious and political and intellectual and cultural upheaval. The scientific revolution involved the emergence of modern science. So there were major developments in mathematics and physics and astronomy and biology and human anatomy and chemistry. And what all of these did collectively was transform the views of society as a whole about nature. In Europe, this started towards the end of the Renaissance period. then influencing the Enlightenment, which was an intellectual movement. So you're not going to be tested about each one of these on the quizzes. Don't panic that you've got to memorize all this, but I'm letting you know how this evolved. Then we've got the French Revolution. This was a period of social and political upheaval in France from around 1789 to 1799. And during the French Revolution, the entire political landscape of France was reshaped. And then there was the American Revolution, another political upheaval around 1765 to 1783. And this is when colonists in the 13 American colonies rejected the British monarchy and the aristocracy and overthrew the authority of Great Britain and founded the US. So outside of the specific details of each of these, they all have one thing in common. In general, they all involved questioning old ways of doing things. They all questioned ways of seeing things. They all questioned the idea of only relying on one perspective or one ideology or one view. Instead, they encouraged, in general, people to question instead of just blindly accepting things. And all of these ideas were further affected by the Industrial Revolution, when both the day-to-day functioning of societies and societies as a whole on a macro level were completely redesigned. Looking at the big picture here, looking at the scope of history, what this has led to is globalization, a term that most people are kind of familiar with now. This term actually pops up for the first time in Chapter 1. And all this means is that economies and countries and cultures that used to be separate are now tied together. And in addition, people are increasingly aware of how interdependent they are. So as I've said before, it's not just everybody existing in isolation. So globalization makes us realize how no country or group of people is truly isolated anymore. Instead, political, economic, and cultural isolation is virtually unheard of. People travel much more than ever before. They migrate to other countries more, and we communicate with other groups more. A common term for this is a global village. And what this means regarding culture specifically is that, unlike earlier in history, people everywhere are much more likely to be exposed to other cultures, in part or in whole, so that are not their own, and this is likely to have an influence on culturally speaking. Now, they certainly may ignore what they're exposed to, or they may incorporate part of it, whether it's food or music or language or clothing or art or literature or dance or religion or a political view, etc. Now, some people in the field of sociology feel that there has actually been a great degree of cultural fragmentation, that postmodernism has developed. And when you think of postmodernism in regards to culture, there are three different aspects. One is that cultures are blended. Another is that authority is eroded. And the last is that core values are unstable. So I want you to imagine an 18-year-old girl living in Canada in 1820 who is Catholic. She would be Catholic with everything it implies. So at that time as a Catholic, she would only adhere to Catholic beliefs, and she would only participate in Catholic rituals or practices, and she would not deviate from that at all. She wouldn't even consider it. She wouldn't be exposed to any kind of religious ideas. Then I want you to picture that same 18-year-old girl from 1820 living in Canada now who is Catholic. She might indeed be baptized as Catholic and maybe even go to church every week. But she would also likely be aware of the beliefs of other faiths and some of their rituals and practices. And she might even support parts of another faith that is not Catholic, like the belief in life after death. Maybe this modern 18-year-old Canadian Catholic girl would attend the church of another religion with a friend, just to see what it's about and decide for herself what she truly believes in, apart from what her family says. And maybe for fun, she goes to see a tarot card reader with a few friends to see what the reader has to say. Maybe she does not consider intercourse before marriage something that should be avoided. All of that would simply not occur in 1820. But in our postmodern era, people are more likely to create their own individualized belief system by mixing together different parts of various religions. I want you to think of a buffet that you go to where you can pick and choose what you want to eat. If you order off the menu, you're limited in what you eat, as well as in the size of the portion that you're served. But at a buffet, not only can you choose what you want to eat, but you can also choose how much of each thing you want. And if you don't like something, you don't have to more of it with a second helping. I have a friend who was raised Jewish, but as an adult, while he still considers his Jewish faith important, he spent some time studying Buddhism, which is a religion based on the teachings of Buddha. And some people actually view it as more of a way of life than a religion. Buddhism involves leading a moral life, being mindful and aware of thoughts and actions, and developing wisdom and understanding. And this friend of mine who was raised Jewish spent some time looking into Hinduism, the ancient religion of India, which encompasses many gods and goddesses and believes in reincarnation based on karma. Hinduism is practiced with yoga, meditation, worship, devotion to a god or goddess, pilgrimage to holy cities, and living according to one's purpose or role. So this friend of mine who was raised and still believes in some parts of that religion also actively lives as a Buddhist and a Hindu. He's chosen different parts of different religious and spiritual systems to suit what he personally, as an individual, wants to believe and practice. So religion is an example of culture, and he has blended various religions. Now, somebody who has very conservative religious beliefs may consider this a negative aspect of modern life, and I firmly believe everybody is entitled to their opinion. At the same time, it's a fact that societies have changed and modernized as history has progressed. So with that in mind, should it come as any surprise that what people want or even truly need from religion has changed as well. Now, the second aspect of postmodernism in relation to culture is authority, specifically the erosion of authority. And I mean, you can really see this in all aspects of life, can't you? Just not in regards to culture. In the 1970s, when you were in school, you could still be strapped by the principal, and they wouldn't need to call your parents first, they would just do it. Now, whether you agree with the removal of the strap from schools or not, it's a good example of the erosion of authority in schools. Here you have 4 versions of the same cartoon, and every couple of years you'll just see it reemerge online and the dates have changed, but I think these all make a good point. Both parents and teachers these days complain that teachers no longer have the authority with students that they used to. And I don't just mean the strap, but authoritative position overall. We see an erosion of authority in society, in politics, in medicine, in policing, in families between children and their parents. And the textbook makes the point that authority is challenged today in regard to parents, teachers, the police, politicians, doctors, in a way it never has been before in history. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? I don't think there's anybody that would flat out state that in all cases, in all situations, people should not be able to challenge authority. But at the same time, has the ability to challenge authority gone too far? I'm thinking of the stories that you'll see online sometimes. You know, you go online and the MSN homepage pops up or whatever, and you see these stories of somebody who has committed a crime like a robbery or a break-in with the weapon, a violent crime. They violently, physically challenge the police in some way. They end up with a minor injury as a result, but they then have the right to challenge the authority of the police and sue them for injury. I think everybody at some point or another has seen a story like this online and you've thought, really? So here you'll see I put a link to an article, 10 criminals who sued their victims. And if the link doesn't work in the presentation, the link is also at the bottom of the overview for this week. You can just click on that. The textbook gives this example of the stereotypical 1950s dad who always knows best and who would always be obeyed by his children, compared to Homer Simpson, whose children usually ignore everything he says. In regards to culture, I'm going to stick with the example of religion when explaining how postmodernists see the erosion of authority, going back to that 18-year-old Catholic girl in 1820. Would she, or anybody at that time, have questioned anything their priest said? In 1820, not likely. At that time, the word of a priest was absolute. And I'm not picking on Catholicism here because it would have been the same with any religion in 1820. In Canada at that time, it would have been virtually impossible to find anyone who is French or English who was not religious, who did not believe in God. However, these days it's very different. These days, the unquestioned authority of the church has eroded, as indicated by the chart in the textbook. The third and last aspect of postmodernism that concerns culture is the instability of core values, which is totally tied into the first 2 points about blending cultures and the erosion of authority. So combined, what do an erosion of authority and a blending of cultures amount to? They lead to there no longer necessarily being a consensus about what values should be core values. And this is not necessarily a good bad thing, I'm just explaining it. I can relate this back to female genital mutilation in Canada. Some Canadians who have come here, who are now Canadian, feel this should be allowed in Canada. They don't agree with the wider Canadian consensus. This might lead to an instability of core values for those women and families for whom this is an issue. Our family has practiced this for so long, but now I'm questioning it. That's what's going through their head. It used to be a core value that children should always listen to the authority of their parents, no matter what. But many would argue that is no longer the case. It used to be a core value that religious figures should dictate various aspects of our daily life, no matter what, without being questioned. And that is no longer the case. It used to be a core societal value that homosexuality was not normal, indicated something sick about a person. And in fact, homosexuality used to be a criminal offense in Canada. It was not removed from the criminal code until 1968. But that has changed. So in many ways, the changes in core Canadian values, the examples I've just provided, are positive, and the vast majority of Canadians would agree that they're positive. But the fact is, when change occurs, instability can result. It's not a guarantee, but it's a distinct possibility. And remember that conflict theory says that change in society is good. The instability might be necessary for change to occur. It might be necessary for society to progress, but it is instability, a lack of consensus. And I also want to point out something the textbook doesn't mention, and that is that even if there's a great deal of instability regarding a core society that does not appear to restabilize, so to speak, as time goes on, with some issues, that stability will simply reappear because time has progressed. So for example, attitudes towards somebody who is not heterosexual are a good example of this. Older generations have been raised differently than you in all ways. socially, in terms of their education, politically, economically, etc. Because of this, as the older generation passes on and younger generations mature into adults, younger generations that have been raised differently from them in a more modern environment, who thus have different attitudes and perceptions, their core values, while different from the older generations, will as a whole be more similar themselves. So some of the core values of society will have gone through that and re-stabilized. Now, the last bit about postmodernism in the textbook I personally found very interesting. So if you haven't read that section yet, please pause the lecture presentation. Do that now, and the section is titled, "Is Canada the First Postmodern Country?" Okay, if you notice the mouse moving around on the screen, it's because I remembered I wanted to read some book, and I had to jump up and get my textbook. So I found this little part particularly interesting, so please take your time reading, "Is Canada the First Postmodern Country?" I really like to talk to students in the classroom about what the differences are between Canadians and Americans. Because on the surface, we do appear to be very similar. And I don't mean in terms of how we look physically, but on the surface, we tend to think of ourselves as having very, very similar daily lives, having very, very similar core values and political beliefs, even if our political systems operate differently. We tend to think of an everyday American and an everyday Canadian having much more in common than they would have different. And as I'm saying this, it's just popping into my head. Go to Google and or YouTube and search Rick Mercer, another episode of Talking with Americans, and demonstrating the cultural differences between the two countries. So when I ask students to explain what the difference is between Canadian culture and American culture, they usually come up with kind of what I'd call simple differences, differences in what we eat. Apparently you can't get ketchup chips in the States. We have Timbits, they have Dunkin' Donuts. You can't get Canada Dry ginger ale in the States, that kind of things. So they usually focus on kind of the smaller things. And I think this is why I like the first bigger paragraph of this section so much, because it summarizes in such an organized and efficient manner the subtle but really important ways that the two countries have developed differently. Remember the American Revolution. The United States rebelled against Great Britain while we accepted her. The states had this stereotypical lawless Western frontiers, while our West just developed. The United States has had much more active focus on individualism and still does. But in Canada, we tend to be more focused on the one for all for one approach. So overall, the United States has a history and a feeling and a personality leading towards being anti-authoritarian, towards being kind of like a rebel. While Canada has a history and a feeling of a personality of being less challenging to authority. We tend to have a reputation for being easy to get along with, the kind of people who just tend to go with the flow. But as the text points out in this section, that has changed. It used to be that the United States were the wilder, less conventional, less traditional family on the block, while we as Canadians were the conservative, church-going, don't cause any trouble family. But in many ways, that's actually flipped in regards to perception of big, in regards to how liberally religious our country is as a whole, in regards to our confidence in our government compared to the United States, even in terms of the importance of a traditional nuclear family. In many ways, Canada is now much, much more liberal than its more conservative neighbor to the south. We have this really strong emphasis in Canada that a person can be who they want to be in terms of their culture and their daily life overall. Now, does that mean that Canadian culture has fragmented and eroded to the point that we no longer have a distinctly Canadian culture? Is it a lack of Canadian culture that leads most immigrants who come to Canada to hyphenate their identity instead of just identifying themselves as Canadians? So they are Italian Canadian or Colombian Canadian or Kenyan Canadian instead of just being Canadian. So to us, that's the norm. But in the US, for the most part, an immigrant would identify themselves as American first. Not always, but it is much more common than in Canada. And again, everybody is completely entitled to their own opinion, but a sociologist would say that absolutely we do have a distinctly Canadian culture that is noticeably different from the United States. Our Canadian culture is based on tolerance and respect for diversity, rather than demanding deference to a singular dominant perspective. And there's a quote in the chapter that explains this very well. And I think this will probably be the only time in the whole course that I actually read to you from the textbook on page 41 on the right side. 25 years of public opinion polling in Canada has taught me a seemingly paradoxical truth. Canadians feel strongly about their weak attachments to Canada, its political institutions, and their fellow citizens. In other words, they feel strongly about the right to live in a society that allows its citizens to be detached from ideology and critical of organizations, and not to feel obliged to be jingoistic or sentimentally patriotic. Canadians' lack of nationalism is, in many ways, a distinguishing feature of the country. So I want you to think that. Canadians' lack of nationalism is, in many ways, a distinguishing feature of our country. So our lack of need to be all gung-ho Canadian is what, in part, makes us Canadian. Opposite of the United States and their tendency, and I know I'm generalizing, to have to be all gung-ho USA, USA, USA. So with this explanation in mind, yes, this suggests that our country is the first postmodern country, truly postmodern.